Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the president of the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation, Larry Kramer.
Thank you. I didn't actually realize I was first. So I had them put the podium up here because my friend Barbara Babcock, who is perhaps the best speaker I know, once said to me, if you have to choose between speaking from the heart and speaking from notes, always choose notes. I'm going to try and do a little of both. And the other thing I should preface this with is what I'm going to talk about, something that we've been working on at the foundation since I arrived, is actually being presented to the board in 2 weeks. So, although I've been talking to them about this for a year. So, we can start with a really simple idea, which is that the political and policymaking process of the U.S. Is currently in some trouble, is I think not a proposition that requires a whole lot of proof. And here we're talking not just about the debt limit, or the fight over funding the national government, although they did time that nicely for my board presentation. But there are many, many other problems that are related to this, and it's not a new problem. This is something that's been brewing literally for decades, arguably since the progressive era itself. It's not just that Congress can't address most of the major problems that we need government to address, but it spreads more broadly. If you look at the state of civic education in this country, a recent study showed that college graduates today know about the same about our government and its system as was true of high school students 30 years ago. There's been enormous decline there. Public confidence in the institutions of government is at an all-time low. Before the last round of fights over the debt ceiling, Congress weighed in at a 10% approval rating, which was the lowest for any institution of government as long as they have been measuring those numbers. And you can go on and on. Now, there is, from our perspective, some confusion, though, about what the nature of the problem is. That is to say, there are multiple different problems that people tend to conflate because they are somewhat interrelated. So oftentimes people will talk about the problem of corruption or the influence of money on politics, special interests being able to get what they want out of government or to stop things that are opposed to their interests. And that's somewhat distinct from the problem of civic engagement or civic participation, which is also a problem. And that itself is distinct from yet a third problem, which would be the problem of political polarization. And by polarization, what we mean is something that has happened within the parties and within the parties in government, right, which is a narrowing of the ideological range within each party and then a movement apart of the two of them. So today, if you look at the measures of the ideological measures by votes of the members of Congress, there's literally no overlap any longer between Democrats and Republicans. And the most conservative Democrat is to the left of the most liberal Republican, and by a fair amount. And that, of course, has produced both hyper-partisanship, with the members of Congress being as interested in seeing the other side lose as they are in getting anything done for themselves, and then gridlock as a result. And I will say one of the misapprehensions that's often put out there is that our Constitution was designed to produce gridlock or to make it really difficult for the federal government to act, which isn't true at all. The Constitution was designed to force deliberation, to force a conversation, to prolong the consideration so that everything would be considered, but it absolutely was designed to create an energetic federal government and one that could address the kinds of problems that needed to be addressed. Our focus is going to be on polarization. And the reason we've chosen that, although it will require addressing some of the other problems, is because we see polarization as the necessary precondition for solving the other two. You're not going to get anything done until you can get the Congress in a position where it is possible to make things happen. Then you can begin to do the kinds of things that will address some of the other problems. And they themselves, the exacerbation of, say, the problem of money in politics, is partly a product of polarization, and then they begin to feed on each other. Now, why take that problem on? And the truth is, it was an interesting thing to me when I arrived at the foundation. Of course, we were doing a lot of things. I was very happy with most of the things that we're doing. I think they're all important. But there are so many other problems that you could address that we don't address now. You could take on, global poverty. I mean, it's hard to imagine a problem that's more important than that. Or health, the multiple health problems that still afflict both in the US and in the rest of the world and so on. So why choose this particular problem? So part of it, I confess, is in a sense selfish. Selfish in the sense that we as a foundation, like most of the big foundations, do our work by trying to leverage our resources to move government policy. And the reason we do that is, on the one hand, our resources are far too small to actually make a dent on any of the major problems that the world faces. And they're dwarfed by the kinds of resources that governments can bring to bear on those same problems. At the same time, our resources are large enough that we can, if we do this well and we do this right, influence public debate and help the government understand the kinds of solutions that are available and move them towards action. So it makes sense from our perspective to begin to do that. On the other hand, that way of working, which, as I say, I think is the way that most of the large foundations work today, rests on certain assumptions about the way in which government will work. Rests primarily on the idea that if you can produce evidence, if you can develop models for how to do things, if you can develop best practices and just put those out there for a rational political process, then it'll work through the process and they will get picked up, if they make sense, and put into effect. And of course, that's simply not applicable anymore. And one of the results for foundations is it has forced us to begin to think about and engage in forms of advocacy that, while perfectly legal, we're not really terribly comfortable with. It is one thing for foundations, which are, after all, large aggregations of wealth that are not politically accountable, to develop evidence and best practices and try and urge the political process to take them up and think about them. It's another thing to try and move the process in the sort of overt political lobbying kinds of ways. And again, just so you know, we do not lobby. My legal counsel may look at this later. We do not lobby, but we need to begin to think about doing that, or we're wasting our money and we're wasting our time because nothing is going to happen with it. Now, and that, I should say, is a reason why, from our perspective, to think about a correction to the democratic process, to begin to move it back towards the ability to deal properly with evidence and models and best practices, is something that's of interest not just to the Hewlett Foundation, but to the entire foundation world, to the entire independent sector. And it's something that we all need to work on together, because everybody is limited in their ability to do this, regardless of where they are on an ideological spectrum, regardless of the kinds of problems that they're dealing with. Another reason, and really more broadly and following from the first reason, is what is true for us is, of course, true for pretty much everybody and everything. The role of the United States in the world today is such that action on so many things depends on the ability of the US to take a leadership position, or at the very least to act. Nothing is going to happen on climate change if the US doesn't eventually get around to doing something. And that's true across multiple problems, whether you're talking about health issues or family planning or, pick your issue. It doesn't actually matter. Our government needs to be able to address problems for the world as well as for our own people, and so it's important that we do what we can. And lastly, if there is a proper role for philanthropy, it is for this kind of problem. One of the constant justifications, we talk about risk capital and taking chances, but it's also the idea that we are, in some sense, by virtue of our unaccountability, neutral. We're not beholden to anybody else's interests. And so we can identify a problem and begin to act on it simply from the perspective of what seems like the best or the right thing to do, without having to worry about somebody else pressuring us to do it in any particular way. So if there is a kind of problem that is appropriate for philanthropy to address, this is it. How do we plan to do this? Of course, that's actually the big problem here. And when you talk about big bets, the bet here is really that it actually seems completely impossible. When I was taking the job, and my colleagues at the law school would say, well, why are you going to do this? I said, well, I'm going to go fix the American democratic process. And that's what they would do. And it does sound completely ridiculous whenever I say it that way. And there are a number of challenges that follow that just need to be thought about even before you begin. So the largest challenge, of course, is this is not something we can do alone. It is completely ridiculous to think that the Hewlett Foundation or any single foundation, no matter how large, could actually do something about this alone. So the first challenge for us is, as we move down the path, and this will be one of the milestones we're going to think about as a measure of whether we're succeeding at all, is the ability to get collaboration from many other foundations, and not just get them working in the space. Because it was surprising to me as I moved into the foundation how little work in philanthropy is actually done in the democracy space writ large. Not none, there was a fair amount, but relative to the size and scale and importance of the problems, it's vanishingly small. So we need not just to get more and more of the foundations thinking about this as a space in which they should be helping and doing work, but everybody needs to be aligned. There needs to be coordination, because otherwise you end up in that situation where everybody is moving forward from their own perspective, but pulling in different directions, and you're not going anywhere at all. So the first challenge is can we get enough other support within the philanthropy world generally to make something possible? A second challenge is there is a sort of Hewlett Foundation way of doing things, I learned when I got there. And it's not completely unique to Hewlett. Obviously, there's a lot of discussion and talk about strategic philanthropy. Strategic philanthropy rests on a couple of assumptions. I mean, the simplest one is that you set clear goals and you measure whether you're actually moving towards those goals before you decide to continue going. But it also rests on, concepts of sort of linear causation, that if you do X, Y will happen. And that you can construct, I hate the phrase logic model, but there you have it, that you can construct something like a logic model in which you can understand why you're doing what you're doing and what you should expect from it. And the fact is that kind of linear causation simply does not apply in this space. The political world is there's not a political system. There are multiple systems and subsystems. They're all interrelated to each other and they're all dynamic. So that we cannot approach this work by thinking we can sketch out a simple model that if we do this, then this will follow, and then we can do the next thing, and it'll move forward towards a solution. Instead, it has to be a different approach, and one that we haven't really followed for quite a while, of taking multiple bets, monitoring them closely, trying to understand really well what's happened, and adapting the strategy constantly as we go forward. A third challenge, and in some ways the most difficult one when we talk about this with people, is this needs to be a policy-neutral approach. So we're not measuring, and we can't measure or think about success in terms of whether the national government begins to adopt the policy solutions that we favor in our other programs. Right? It is true, we want to fix the democratic process so that the US, say, for instance, can do something about climate change. But the measure whether we've done so is not whether the action the government takes on climate change is the actions that we think it ought to take. That kind of would miss the point. Right? The idea is to have a democratic process that works in the sense that when the evidence is out there, you can get some kind of rational deliberation and then action out of the government. But what that action is, if it is in fact democratic, you can't predict ahead of time, and you can't set those as your particular goals. Making that, I should say, particularly difficult is the things themselves that we want to do all read as political, in the short term at least. So now if you think about, say, campaign finance reform, or reform on voter registration, or just pick your issue, it all reads, because it's all been played out over the last few years, as either favoring the Democrats or favoring the Republicans. And it makes it difficult to present any sort of effort to change or reform any of the rules this way without being labeled as, oh, you're just, this is, of course, the Hewlett Foundation, it's a progressive liberal foundation, of course they want more people to vote. The truth is, and this is just a message we need to hammer home, all of these things are neutral in the long run. However they read in the short run, if they work the way we want them to work and simply create a political process that is more rationally responsive to evidence and to what the public perceives and learns about and believes should be done, who wins just depends on who has the better arguments and who can make that work over time. So having more people vote is not favorable to the Democrats or to the Republicans in the long run. It requires both of them to simply have policy solutions that will appeal to a larger number of the voters. But of course, it's better if you win by appealing to a majority of the voters than by suppressing some portion of that electorate that you think won't do what you want to do. And the last, and in some ways the most difficult challenge in my mind, is as we start this work, there is an enormous amount of conventional wisdom about how to do this, most of which is wrong. Now, when I say that, it's not because I've decided that I think it's otherwise. But one of the, for me, really interesting discoveries, having come from the academy into the philanthropy world, is while we, and here I mean not just Hewlett, but most of the foundations provide an awful lot of support for an awful lot of research, we tend not to turn to universities to help us figure out what the best or right answers are for the problems that we want to address. And you see this. There's a conventional wisdom which is out there. You read column after column about, oh, the problem here is we just need to fix gerrymandering. And then if you actually go look at what the social science shows us and what the political scientists have done in their work, it gives you a completely different story, and there's very little connection there. So a big part of this is really informing ourselves and informing the other foundations that will work with us, and then beginning to inform the public that the solutions to this are somewhat different than the ones that people have thought about. Now, I'm happy to talk about that at a different point if it comes up, obviously at least not here, not right now. So that said, the way we're looking at to approach this is really, it's a large problem. It needs to be addressed globally, which means working across the entire range of issues that have been raised. There are basically 4 large areas in which we're planning to try and get something done. The first is governing institutions, right? The solutions that we need here are solutions within the representative institutions of our government. There are a lot of people who want to turn for their solutions. If Congress isn't working, let's try and get it done through executive agencies. Let's try and get it done through independent agencies because we can get them to act for us. Let's try and get it done through the courts. Well, those are not in the long run very healthy for any society, and certainly not for a democratic one. So we need to find ways to get the representative governing institutions more capable of acting, and one of the big blockages is their own internal rules. The filibuster is the most well-known one, hardly the only one, and probably not even the biggest problem. There are multiple rules that have developed over the last 20 or 30 years that have created all sorts of obstacles to getting things done that allow minorities within minorities to block things. Second is the area of campaigns and elections, which is the one most people think of, and there the set of issues I think are familiar. There's districting, there is primary elections, there's campaign finance, there's voter access. All of those things need to be worked on. Third is civic education and participation. It is absolutely the case that you want a public that is engaged, that knows the issues as they need to, and that will come to the voting booth and act on that basis. And there are all sorts of problems there. And then last is the media. We've had an enormous change in the media environment over the last 30 years. It used to be when I grew up, when probably most, well, looking out here, some of you grew up, there were basically 3 networks and 3 newspapers. They were all pretty centrist. Everybody turned to them for information. It meant we were all operating on roughly the same factual basis, even if we disagreed about what to do about it. That's fragmented. You have the filter bubbles and the echo chambers as people turn to multiple sources that tell them what they already want to hear, and we need a solution to that. And so, the idea is to work across all of those stages, in stages, testing things out, seeing what seems to work and where we can move the ball a little bit, and then doubling up the effort there, continuing to explore, work for new solutions. We are approaching this in stages. The idea is let's start with a sort of 3-year period where we can see if we can set the ground. Can we get the kind of collaboration we need? Can we get the research done to fill in the gaps and get better understanding of what we can do to succeed? And if after 3 years it looks like the ground is promising, then to move it forward. I'm going to ask the board to set as a tentative second stage date 2026, kind of arbitrarily chosen, except that it happens to be the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, which seemed somehow appropriate. So thank you and wish us luck.